National Presbyterian Museum, tucked away in the basement of St. John's Presbyterian Church in Toronto, is truly a national treasure of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The museum came about in the 1990s as the Reverend Dr. John A. Johnston began gathering artifacts from across the country that had historical significance to the church. The National Presbyterian Museum, the only one of its kind in Canada, was officially opened and dedicated on September 29, 2002, as a place to house and display the historical artifacts of the Presbyterian Church in Canada.
Now imagine a family funeral, and in this case it's the family funeral of the matriarch who writes all the letters, who remembers all the birthdays, who keeps the family together. And when she dies, everybody wonders, is the family going to stay together? Is it going to stay a family? Well, something pretty important happens at her funeral. There's the service, of course, but arguably more important is what happens afterwards. The family gets together and they eat and they drink and they share the family stories. And you can picture that. Do you remember the time that she caught us out back smoking behind the hedge? Do you remember the time when her cat got up on the roof and she called the fire department? Do you remember? Do you remember? And do you remember? And in remembering those stories, in telling those stories over and over again, the family is reformed. In truth, a family is more than shared DNA. A family is a shared set of stories. And you might want to think of the Presbyterian Church as a big, extended, sometimes dysfunctional, sometimes happy family with a set of stories. There is a set of stories that we share with all other Christians, the stories of the Bible. There are stories that we share with all other Presbyterian and Reformed Christians around the world, the stories of the Reformation, of John Calvin and John Knox and the Huguenot refugees from France, and of the missionary endeavor around the world. Those are our stories. And there's also a set of stories that belong in particular to the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and those stories are celebrated in the Presbyterian Museum.
The museum's wide variety of exhibits, including replicas of a 19th century pioneer chapel and a minister's study, immerse visitors in the rich history of our denomination's mission and ministry in Canada and around the world.
When I consider confirmation programs, a trip to the museum I think would be foundational to a year's curriculum. It's a great opportunity for young people to really get into the history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, to hear about it, to learn about it, to ask questions, to touch it, to experience it. So a few years ago we took an intergenerational group to Toronto for a day trip and incorporated into that a trip to the museum. So our group of 40 plus was grandparents and parents and teens and kids, and we weren't sure whether or not this museum trip would work for them. It turned out to be the best part of the day. It was a real blast for them. And I think what was the neat part was that it wasn't going to look at history, it was going to touch history. Before we went into the museum, the curator took us into a separate room and talked us through an old-fashioned communion service experience. And then we actually got to reenact it. And so some of the young children were asked to stand outside of the circle to keep watch for anyone who could come and see what we were doing. And we passed the bread and the wine around to one another in this small, tight-knit group and reenacted an old communion service out in the forest. One of the most powerful experiences as I reflect on that trip was the bus ride home, because I got to witness grandparents talking to their kids and sharing their own history as members of the Presbyterian Church for their whole lives. And when we came back to the congregation in the weeks that followed, there was much sharing that happened between all the generations. It really pulled our church together. I wouldn't say that a trip to the museum is exclusive to young people. It's informative for people who are new to the Presbyterian Church, no matter what their age. I think it's a great opportunity to discover the roots of who we are in this country and who we are today. And as we consider going into the future, it's always good to know who we are and who we have been.
The Presbyterian Church in Canada has made a commitment to securing the future of the museum through a campaign to raise $300,000 for the Reverend Dr. John A. Johnston Fund, so named for the museum's founder. We ask you to share our dream and to contribute to this place where we stop to remember and give thanks, and to look forward to even greater possibilities in service to our God through Jesus Christ.